Hello and welcome to The Context USA with me, Katrina Perry, in Washington. Today, relief for Israelis and Palestinians, a diplomatic victory lap for President Trump. In a special programme, we take a look at those key developments on a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas.
This is the Middle East. It's the biggest, most complicated deal. And also it's the place that could lead to tremendous problems like World War III. They always talk about World War III would start in the Middle East. And that's not going to happen.
No American president has ever done more for Israel. In response to this barbaric attack on October 7th, Israel did what it had to do.
A huge and overwhelming sense of relief and joy in Gaza, in the occupied West Bank, as well as among Israeli families.
On our panel tonight, David Schenker, former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and Laura Blumenfeld, former Senior Policy Advisor at the State Department's Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team and now Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. Hello and welcome to the special edition of Context USA. Well, the US President Donald Trump has labelled today a tremendous day for the Middle East. After years of fierce fighting, of destruction and of death, a ceasefire deal struck between Israel and Hamas moved through a critical moment today. At the centre of all of this, President Trump's 20-point peace plan. Now, over the next hour, we're going to analyse it, the diplomacy, the politics, and the influence of President Trump. We'll take stock of what we've seen today, and there has been plenty, and look at what comes next. In a moment, we'll get the latest from the region, but first, let's have a look back at how today unfolded. Well, the morning brought joy and relief for Israelis with the confirmation that all 20 remaining living hostages held by Hamas for 2 years had been freed. After medical checks, they were reunited with their families. The bodies of 4 others were also returned, with 24 more deceased hostages expected to come back to Israel in the next few days. This is Attain Moore meeting his parents. The 25-year-old was working as a security guard at the Nova Music Festival. He saved dozens of people before being kidnapped himself by Hamas gunmen.
I always boasted there about my parents and the good upbringing they gave me. Eliakim, of blessed memory, always told me that his father used to say to him, "Don't be right, be wise." Many times there, you had to be wise.
There were cheering crowds too in the West Bank and in Gaza as part of the first phase of this ceasefire deal. Israel has released almost 2,000 Palestinian prisoners and detainees.
The situation is very difficult for the young men. No food, no drink, no medical care. The young people are constantly subjected to oppression and torment. I wish everyone would pay attention to their situation. Being released is an indescribable feeling.
This story, too, is, of course, about President Trump, the US leader, widely credited as the driving force to this peace agreement. Today, he made a whirlwind trip to the region to see the first steps of his 20-point plan play out and to receive those thanks and gratitude in person. The day began for the president in the Israeli Knesset, the warmest of welcomes in the parliament there for the US leader. To a crowd of cheers, President Trump told Israeli lawmakers that the long and painful nightmare was over. Traditionally fierce rivals across the aisle, Israel's political leaders had only glowing comments for Donald Trump.
No American president has ever done more for Israel. And as I said in Washington, it ain't even close. It's really not a match. Mr. President, today We welcome you here to thank you for your pivotal leadership in putting forward a proposal that got the backing of almost the entire world. A proposal that brings all our hostages home.
This is a historic moment and a reminder that history is shaped by people. It is shaped by those who know the past but have the vision to change the future. When you were elected, you declared that you would be the president of peace. You have kept your word.
Well, then the president moved from Israel to Egypt, from the momentous occasion of today's events to a crucial discussion on what comes next. President Trump joined world leaders in the city of Sharm el-Sheikh for a summit on Gaza's future. This would be a moment of change for the region, said President Trump, and for the US leader, another war he's claimed to have solved.
After years of suffering and bloodshed, the war in Gaza is over. Humanitarian aid is now pouring in, including hundreds of truckloads of food, medical equipment, and other supplies, much of it paid for by people in this room. Civilians are returning to their homes. The hostages are reuniting. I mean, it's beautiful. I'm just watching it backstage. The level of love and sorrow, I've never seen anything like it.
Well, our Middle East correspondent Hugo Bachega is at that summit in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt.
This was a victory lap for President Trump, with more than 30 world leaders gathered here in Sharm el-Sheikh, a significant sign of international support, including from key regional players for his plan in Gaza. I thought it was very interesting that behind those leaders, when they gathered, there was a huge banner saying, "Peace in the Middle East." Now, we know that that's simply not the case, but this is how the president is selling this plan for Gaza, perhaps the beginning of something bigger, perhaps the beginning of a plan for the entire region. Now, what we know is that negotiations, according to the president, are already underway over the remaining points of his 20-point plan for Gaza. We know that significant sticking points remain, including the future of Hamas, the scale of the Israeli withdrawal, and also about who is going to govern Gaza after the war. We haven't seen any kind of timeline, no plans related to these future negotiations. But again, the president has been very optimistic, saying that the war is over and that the ceasefire is going to hold. Again, as expected, the president made some bold statements, some exaggerated claims, but the reality is that words alone would not be enough to solve this region's conflicts.
Well, we have a lot to break down and discuss over the next hour or so on our panel tonight, David Schenker and Laura Blumenfeld. Thanks to you both for being with us here. Just want to get your first thought. We've heard a lot from President Trump about what a momentous day this is, quite definitively saying the war is over. What's your first thought? Is it as significant as he's laying out? David, to you first.
Well, good evening. No doubt in my mind, it's a remarkable and highly significant day, significant accomplishment, bringing home these hostages, 2 years in Hamas's dungeons, 2,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails released. This itself, I think, is a remarkable accomplishment. We've been waiting for this for some time, but it is, I think, an exaggeration to say that we have peace. What we have is a ceasefire with a plan, with so many I's to dot and T's to cross, that this could go sideways at any point in time, particularly if there's a lapse in administration attention.
Laura, what's your view in terms of today and maybe how it differs to where we were with that previous ceasefire deal on the 20th of January or thereabouts?
Right. I'd say the ceasefire in January was about potential. Today is much bigger. I would say it's all caps promise. It's President Trump coming to the promised land, in a nod to his evangelical base and connecting with those biblical images of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as he invoked. It's about promises kept. He promises to bring home what he called our hostages, identifying strongly with the Israeli hostages as well. And it's about promise in the terms of potential, expanding the Abraham Accords, even daring to mention a peace accord with Iran while standing in the Israeli parliament, which is pretty tricky considering that Netanyahu had addressed the U.S. Congress opposing a nuclear deal with Iran. And then finally, just reminding Netanyahu right in front of him that you have promises to keep as well, that the war is in fact over, because just a few days ago, Netanyahu was saying publicly the campaign will continue.
And indeed, it was Israel that breached that ceasefire back in March. So, David, what's different now to the pressure that President Trump is putting on Prime Minister Netanyahu and all the parties to get to the point of today?
Well, there is enormous leverage with the Prime Minister. Israel has cast its lot essentially in the United States with the Republican Party. And so Trump is more popular in a way than Netanyahu in Israel. He can reach out to the Israeli people and was able, I think, in the aftermath of the attack in Doha, to really bring in not only all the Arab countries, but also Pakistan, Indonesia, and importantly, Turkey. Turkey and Qatar were Hamas's best friends, and they were able to isolate and put pressure on Hamas to get this far. And so I think there is sufficient pressure on both sides. Once again, if there is a persistent attention at senior levels of the administration moving forward to keep this potentially on track. But, this is a story of the president having pressure uniquely on both sides at this point in time.
And for all the praise put on him today, he put a lot of praise on the leaders of Turkey and Qatar himself, Laura, didn't he?
Yes. It was interesting at that meeting today. It was Peace 2025. Notice that it was English. There was no Arabic. There was no Hebrew. It wasn't a multicultural French event, although he gathered the world leaders. And Trump took attendance. He wanted to know who was showing up and who wasn't. It was very clear that he has this kind of bilateral treat approach to his relationships. Qatar has played a heavy lifting role, and they now have an air-based presence in the United States with their F-15s. And as he said, there are no more excuses. He was talking to world leaders, thanking Erdogan for being the tough, thick-skinned guy that he can identify with from Turkey, but also saying, no more Gaza excuse, no more Iran. I expect you all to show up. I thought it was significant that when the sort of public remarks ended, he turned his back and got into some kind of intense conversation with the leader of Indonesia, who he's trying, I think, to sort of herd along, as you can herd leaders in the Middle East, to sort of break through and make peace with Israel. So I think he's kind of showing an admirable emotional intelligence, but he's a can-do American from the East Coast, which means he isn't afraid to speak Middle East, which is we can do it the easy way or the hard way.
And we'll get into that diplomatic body language a little bit later on, because there were quite a lot of fascinating observations, I thought, at that Sharm el-Sheikh meeting. But I just want to get the view from Egypt now. We're joined by Hussein Haredi. He's former Egyptian Assistant Foreign Minister. Thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News. What's your view from your position? There was a lot of praise from President Trump for the role that Egypt has played in getting to today as well. What's your sense looking at today? It's night time where you are, how significant it's been?
From an Egyptian point of view, it's highly significant that the President of the United States, Mr. Donald Trump, has come to the Middle East, specifically visited Israel and Egypt in order to push his peace plan. And his plan is not only about bringing the war in Gaza to an end. I guess it's about reshaping the region as a whole, including Iran. And so I guess, and what he has done is, of course, from a historical point of view, comes within the American involvement in what was called some time ago the peace process, establishing peace between the Arab countries, Israel, and during the Clinton administration, even going as far as speaking about a Palestinian state. And we all recall that former President Clinton gave a speech before the National Assembly of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. And he went to Gaza by plane, and his plane landed in the Gaza airport. So I guess President Trump has been personally involved, and we hope that his involvement in these attempts to establish peace in the Middle East would continue, and and the Arabs and the coordination and the cooperation between the Arab countries, including Egypt and the United States under the leadership of President Trump, would continue, because in our view, that would keep the momentum that we have seen today, and we would call it, certainly some people would say this was a historic visit by the United States president, and we hope to build on the promises that President Trump gave today, particularly in Sharm el-Sheikh.
You mentioned, Hussein Hardy, you mentioned there that interaction between President Clinton and the Palestinian Authority. There was a warm embrace between Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and President Trump at Sharm el-Sheikh today. But we haven't heard explicitly from President Trump that he is in favour of a two-state solution. There's some loose language around it in the peace plan. I think it's point 19 out of 20. So how difficult do you see the path ahead now?
Well, we understand that President Trump hasn't come forward, whether in when he was in office from 2017 to 2021 or during the last 9 months. He hasn't stated explicitly the two-state solution. But I remember once he said that if the parties concerned want such a solution, the two-state solution, that's up to them. So I guess my take on this, on his position, is that he doesn't want to be so committed with this idea of the two-state solution. Maybe because so far it hasn't happened. Maybe he doesn't want to be his name and his presidency and his White House is associated with an idea. From his perspective, definitely, that is not feasible, for at least for the time being. But I guess he is open. The Arab countries and the Palestinians, once the Palestinians get their act together, I guess the Arab side can discuss the two-state solution with President Trump. Let's remember that President Trump is still in the first year of his second term. And we are hopeful that in the next 3 years, a lot can happen in the Middle East for the security and stability of all the people and all the countries in the region.
And just briefly, in a short-term view, have you had any information about the reopening of the Rafah crossing between Egypt and into Gaza to get that aid flood in that has been promised as part of this deal?
As far as aid is concerned, I understand that 400 trucks per day are allowed to enter Gaza. And as far as the Palestinians, the Rafah crossing, the European Union would send its team of observers to the Rafah crossing on next Wednesday, and starting from tomorrow, people could exit and enter through the Rafah crossing normally. And even those Palestinians who were stranded during the last 2 years and wanted to re-enter Gaza, they will be starting from tomorrow. They would be able to do that. So these are good news for the Palestinians.
Okay, Hussein Hardy, former Egyptian Assistant Foreign Minister, thank you very much for speaking to us here on BBC News.
Thanks for having me, man.
Okay, just want to bring back in our panel, David Schenker and Laura Blumenfeld. Just listening to Hussein Hardy there, David, a lot of focus in the region on specifically the role that Donald Trump himself is playing and will play here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he is the indispensable actor. It was sheer force of personality and will, and a combination of a special relationship with Israel and his close ties with leadership of the Arab world that actually made this possible. Actually, I wanted to correct one of the things that the ambassador said from Cairo. Actually, the Vision for Peace did talk about a two-state solution. We still have, I think, an Israeli reticence to accept a Palestinian Authority role. And this proposal, as you note correctly, talks very little about a two-state solution. In fact, it talks about the United States helping to foster and supervise an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue, and that we can talk about self-determination after the Palestinian Authority reforms, something that I think is a distant at best prospect. But to be sure, this wouldn't have happened without Trump.
And Laura, on that point, President Trump has shifted the position of the US away from that two-state solution to this more loose place that we're in now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always a kind of rose-tinted approach when you're approaching a Middle East peace, because as we know, the devil is in the details, and that's what we've struggled over for the last 2 years as we've tried to get to some kind of ceasefire. I think he does understand, however, he's a golfer. He knows it's all about follow through. So I don't think he's going to drop this just sort of mid-swing. He's committed. I used to kind of say or quip that Trump was all about oil wells and Nobels, about money and winning the prize. But I think I'm going to add a third, which is no hell. I think he's on a redemption tour. I really do see this kind of spiritual biblical element being injected. After all, it is the Holy Land. I think that, he has said that his favorite quote from the Bible is an eye for an eye, but I think he's looking at constructive revenge. As he said today to the Israeli parliament, when he talked about opportunity for the Palestinians, he said, rather than blowing yourselves up or tearing down your enemy, you now have an opportunity to build yourself up. And so I do think that, whether it's going to be two states, a confederation, I do think there's a commitment there, though, to do right by the Palestinians as well as the Israelis.
OK, well, we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. We're going to take a quick break. Do stay with us. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Welcome back to The Context USA. Well, let's turn our focus now to those in Gaza. 2 years of war have left more than 60,000 Palestinians dead, according to the health ministry there. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced. Across the globe, the world witnessed warnings of a growing humanitarian crisis, including famine. Now, as part of this first phase of this ceasefire deal, aid agencies are scaling up their response in Gaza. The UN would return to a lead role in distributing it. And ahead of the release of the hostages, Israeli troops withdrew to a line that has left them now in control of 53% of Gaza. We can see it illustrated on our screen there. And according to the Donald Trump plan, this would be the first of 3 stages of Israeli withdrawal over the next period of time. Well, let's bring back in David Schenker and also Laura Blumenfeld. Laura, when we look at that aid point and what's going to happen now in terms of the Israeli withdrawal and the amount of land that they're controlling, where does the faith lie there, or the hope, as we were talking about earlier, the promise that this will get what is needed to the Palestinian people?
Yeah, I think the big question hanging over today, especially the Sharm el-Sheikh meeting, is the Arab leaders and the roles that they'll play. Are these vague promises? We've seen that in the past. I was involved in the sort of aftermath of a war in 2014. Are these vague promises? Are they hard-packed partnership? They're going to need tremendous surge, not only of aid, but reconstruction materials. The problem is, though, I hate to bring up problems on a day of hope, but they're talking about reconstruction is really contingent on demilitarization. Now, let's just look at ourselves and ask really honestly, who is going to walk the streets of Gaza and tell the Hamas fighters who are back, taking their positions, put down your guns? I think we're going to get into a problem there. Yes, we can surge in, the humanitarian aid. We're talking about 600 trucks a day, but that's just a trickle of what's needed.
David, what's your view on that?
Yeah, those are the key, the I's that need to be dotted and the T's that need to be crossed. The plan has, 20 points, and we're only at about 0.4 right now. The humanitarian assistance, the governance, the security, the Arab role, right? The International Stabilization Force. Several Arab countries reportedly agreed and told Trump that they would deploy forces there. What are their rules of engagement? Will they open fire on Hamas? How many weapons will Hamas be able to keep in the disarmament phase? In Iraq, we had agreements where people could keep their AK-47s and 2 clips. I don't think that's going to be acceptable for the Israelis. Who's going to dispose of the miles, the tens or hundreds of miles of tunnels that remain under Gaza? All open questions. For the time being, I think there will be humanitarian relief. Even this, though, is controversial. What role the UN will play. UNRWA is not going back. That's a non-starter for the Israelis. Can the World Food Program do it? Another UN agency? What is the role of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, sort of a U.S.-Israeli creation? We will see. I think these are what's currently under discussion. I don't think that's all been hashed out just yet, but I expect to see less hunger in the very near future.
Indeed, we're hearing some reports from inside Gaza that those Gaza Humanitarian Foundation posts had started to be dismantled. I mean, Laura, would you welcome that it is the United Nations who will once again be taking the lead role, irrespective of which agency it is, of getting the aid into Gaza that's needed?
I mean, I don't think we can be picky, right? This is an imminent crisis. It's urgent. I think whoever can do it and do it well. I was participating in some meetings during the last administration on how to figure this out. The administration, this government and any American administration is capable of feeding 2 million people if they put their heads and minds to it. This is a handshake president. We understand that. Is he a hair-splitting president? Will he be there for the details? One hopes so. There are plans in every drawer of every desk of the State Department, I can tell you, for reforming the PA, for, feeding the people of Gaza, for military assistance and training and cooperation for local forces. It's just a matter of, whose blood and whose treasure is going to be invested in this effort.
Well, there might be plans in all those drawers in the State Department, but with a shutdown underway, can anyone open those drawers and actually get them out at this point? But David, it just briefly speaks to that issue of how this really is just the tip of the plan for what lies ahead today.
Yeah, everything still needs to be sorted out. You could say now comes the hard part, right? This plan, ultimately, it was all about ending the war and disarming Hamas, getting the hostages back. If we don't get to disarmament, we're going to find ourselves with a ceasefire that looks like Lebanon, where the Israelis are compelled to continue from the perimeter to strike Hamas in Gaza. And I don't think that's the peace that President Trump is envisioning, frankly.
OK, well, we're going to get into detail as to what may lie ahead in just a moment. So David Schenker and Laura Blumenfeld, do stay with us on this special edition of The Context USA as we are picking apart that ceasefire plan and President Trump's role in it. So do stay with us here on BBC News.
Hello. There was a lot of cloud across the UK again on Monday. It was thickest across the south of England and Wales, thick enough even for some patches of drizzle lasting into the afternoon. And although on the face of it, the satellite picture, the cloud looks pretty much the same everywhere, it was actually quite a bit lower in the north of the UK, low enough to allow the mountain tops to poke through it. And so if you'd have gone for a walk in the mountains, for example, Glencoe, you'd have been out in glorious sunshine. And once the sunshine had formed around the mountains, it did spread to neighbouring areas. So northwest Wales did see some decent sunshine as well. Overnight tonight, mist and fog patches look to develop, I think, across parts of Scotland and northern England, especially with visibility down to 100 to 200 metres. The cloud that we have across England, Wales and Northern Ireland thickening up to bring some mist and some patches of drizzle. So for some, it is going to be a grey and a damp start to the day on Tuesday with, again, cloud reluctant to break up. Then the best of the sunshine, again, is quite likely across parts of Scotland and Northern England. Our temperatures not changing too much, highs between 14 and 17 degrees. On into Wednesday's forecast, the high pressure is still with us, so the weather looks pretty quiet again. Mist and fog patches to start the day, and again, probably the best of the sunshine will be across parts of Scotland, northern England, and maybe western areas of Wales too. This dry run of weather continues through the rest of the week and into the start of the weekend, but from Sunday onwards, low pressure moves in, bringing a prolonged spell of unsettled weather.
Three, two, one, action.
At this virtual production studio near Vancouver, they're developing the latest tech to make driving scenes in movies look more convincing. We'll take this car for a spin. On Tech Now on BBC News.
This season's Champions League is up and running. 36 teams across Europe targeting one of the most prestigious prizes in club football. Can PSG hold on to their trophy? We'll have all the latest results, features and interviews right here on BBC News.
As deadlines for Russia to end its invasion continue to expire without consequence, is President Trump still dedicated to peace in Ukraine? Can Europe help out on its own? And what about the people of Ukraine? Our team are here to answer your questions. Join me, Lucy Hopkins, for Ukrainecast on BBC News.
Little bit of onion. Thanks so much. It smells fantastic.
It's feeding time at the Liberty Sanctuary.
Sometimes I don't know where to find all this food. Sometimes in the evening I pray, what shall I give tomorrow?
Welcome to Hokkaido.
Thank you. This looks incredible. So this behind us is what this is going to become.
Yes, it's like the most exciting festival that happens in this region.
Here in the Maldives, sandbanks like this appear and disappear. They constantly change size and shape according to the seasons and the ocean's forces.
Inspiring travel. Watch now on iPlayer.
Let's be honest, politics can feel a bit scripted sometimes, even rehearsed. But not here. On Politics Live, it's real conversations with politicians, commentators, campaigners, and now your voice will help shape the debate. Whether it's the NHS, immigration, or the cost of living, it's unfiltered discussions about the things that matter to you. So join me, Vicky Young, for Politics Live, tomorrow at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer.
Hello and welcome back to The Context USA. I'm Katrina Perry here in Washington. President Donald Trump and world leaders sign a ceasefire agreement for Gaza in the Egyptian city of Sharm el-Sheikh. Earlier in the day, 20 living hostages held by Hamas were released and returned to Israel. Meanwhile, almost 2,000 people were released by Israel as part of the ceasefire agreement. Welcome back. Now, we've been talking about it all day long, right across the weekend, even last week. Indeed, the centre of everything today is about what got us here, and that is President Trump's 20-point plan, unveiled a couple of weeks ago at the White House with the Israeli Prime Minister standing beside him. This was the path to a permanent end to the war between Israel and Hamas. In it, a little of what we've seen happen today: the return of the Israeli hostages, the release of Palestinian prisoners and detainees, and aid rolling into Gaza at scale. But those are just 3 or so of the 20 points. And while we've seen the parties sign up to the first phase of this plan, many details for the later phases of this ceasefire could be harder to reach agreement on, as we've been discussing. Like, what does governance in Gaza look like? What is the extent of the Israeli troop withdrawal and the disarmament of Hamas? In Egypt today, world leaders led by President Trump signed a document cementing the deal. But it's unclear whether this was either the space or time or place for lengthy discussions to work through those particularly hard sticking points for what lies ahead. Nevertheless, the US president appeared optimistic about the future of the plan and the unity behind it.
All the momentum now is toward a great, glorious, and lasting peace, and our commitment to fulfilling the 20-point plan we developed together will be the crucial foundation for achieving that bright future, and it's being worked on right now as we speak, and we're actually in stage 3 and 4. It's not going to be, just divided down so simply. We can be long advanced on some of the things that we say we're going to do. We can take them out of order in a positive way, and we've shown how it can be done with responsible nations like the people in this room, these incredible people in this room, setting aside their differences, seeking common ground, and pursuing a better world for all of us.
Well, we've been talking about what's happened today and that plan with two people who know all about these sorts of negotiations: David Schenker, former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and Laura Blumenfeld, former Senior Policy Advisor on the State Department's Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team and now a Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. There's lots to talk about on the diplomacy front about what we saw today. Remarkable images in many ways. So many world leaders, particularly in Sharm el-Sheikh, queued up to walk on stage with President Trump behind a sign that said Peace 2025, one by one, shaking hands with him. David, very much this was President Trump in the centre of the deal in many ways.
Front and center as always. We had, as we've grown accustomed to, a long, rambling, unscripted press conference with all the leaders of the Arab world, many European leaders. I should mention a grimacing Antonio Guterres of the UN. And then after a bit of a signing or a private pull aside, there was another Trump address, with everyone standing, not sitting behind him. He was presiding. He sees himself as the leader of the free and unfree world. And I think everybody behind him was willing to indulge him. We are here, after all, because of him. And he knows it. And so we saw what was the Trump show. But it was a victory lap, not only in the Knesset, but in Sharm el-Sheikh.
And Laura, in many ways, this was like an international edition of some of those President Trump cabinet meetings that we've seen, where he was going around the room telling various people what a good job they were doing in their countries, congratulating the president of Egypt for how low crime is in Egypt at one point. And everyone seemingly happy, as David says, to be there and do what he said and stand behind him. He made a joke about leaders like these don't normally stand behind anyone, but they're standing behind me today. Is this where diplomacy is at now? It's leaning into that transactional thing that we know President Trump likes.
Well, it's very, very personal. It reminded me of White House dinners where the president stands and greets various Hollywood celebrities or, the governor of Oklahoma, and kind of does a little bit of business in between. I thought it was very interesting who showed up, but I think it's even more interesting who wasn't there. Prime Minister Netanyahu got a last-minute invitation, and there are sort of two versions of why he didn't attend. After all, this is about the future of his country. One is that he was worried about his domestic right politics because the right-wing members of his coalition would object. And others say that no, that actually Erdogan of Turkey, the leader of Turkey, threatened to pull his attendance if, somebody who he considered a committer of genocide, Prime Minister Netanyahu, was in attendance. So that's interesting. It's also notable, President Trump himself seemed to be surprised that the leader of the UAE, the Emirati leader, was not there. He sort of called out MBS and then he wasn't there. I'm sorry, MBZ. And also Saudi Arabia's crown prince wasn't there. Look, if President Trump considers this the golden era, as he has promised America and the world, it's that black gold that's going to grease the wheels of peace. And if two of his biggest partners didn't show up and President Trump kept talking about it as a sign of respect, I think that's really notable. Let's put that in our pockets and see, how that plays out. The other person, the other party who wasn't there, I think, which is very interesting, of course, is Iran. They did receive an invitation, understandable why they didn't attend. But I was struck by how often President Trump mentioned Iran, both in the Israeli Knesset, where it was kind of, to take a New York Yiddish word, it was chutzpah on his part to bring up a nuclear accord standing there in the Israeli parliament. But then again, in Sharm el-Sheikh, he talked about how Iran was ready to make a deal. I think what he's presenting really is a choice to the region and the world. There are two clocks, right? There's the Iran clock that's 2040. It's in Palestine Square in Tehran, which is ticking backward, or was actually before Israel bombed it, but it was ticking backward toward what they were hoping to be the elimination of the state of Israel in 2040. And then Saudi Arabia is a more forward-looking clock. They have an economic plan called Vision 2030, which is trying to sort of shift away from those fossil fuels to a different kind of economy. And that's what Trump is trying to kind of harness, is the enthusiasm to move the region forward in a language he's very comfortable with, which is all about economics, commerce, and wealth.
And David, do you agree with that he has an eye on a much bigger vision here?
Yeah, he does. I mean, he said from day one, actually, he talks every day about how he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize, about how he's getting an agreement per month. He mentioned today in Sharm el-Sheikh, when he got announcing the leader of Azerbaijan was there sitting next to the leader of Armenia, that he had gotten a peace agreement between those two states. He talks about how he wants to enlarge the Abraham Accords. This is not something that is, I think, peripheral for him. This is central. He wants to make peace. And he tried with Ukraine. He hasn't gotten there. He'll go back to that later. But he sees, I think, tremendous opportunity. And as Laura said, I think this all centers around this idea of regional integration, normalization, economic opportunity, just everything that would stem from more enlargement of the Accords, and end to the war in Gaza, everything that he dreams is possible for this region technologically, energy-wise.
And David, sorry, just when you're talking about the Abraham Accords there, what struck me was how front and centre Jared Kushner was to everything today, sitting there beside Steve Witkoff. Jared Kushner, obviously the president's son-in-law, who was in many ways the architect of those Abraham Accords in the first Trump administration. You would know him. How remarkable is it that he seems to be back in the fold, having been absent for a lot of the campaign and a lot of the early months?
Yeah, he is, as I see him, he's the Swiss Army knife of the Trump administration. So if you've got a hard mission, you put him on the task. And of course, he is working with many of the leaders in the Gulf as a hedge fund manager. He knows these people from round the Trump administration 1. And he's really tied in with the government of Israel as well. So I think it was, not only Steve Witkoff, but really adding Jared to the mix and then whatever role Tony Blair played in mapping out these points, that pushed it over the finish line, vetting it with the Arabs, getting their buy-in, enlarging it to include Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey. This was, believe it or not, we generally don't ascribe strategic thinking to the Trump administration, but this was, I think, case in point.
OK, well, we're going to talk about Tony Blair and the Board of Peace, of which President Trump is the chair, in just a moment. So do stay with us. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. You're watching The Context USA on BBC News. Well, let's talk a little bit more, as we just touched on there, the future of Gaza and the leadership there. According to President Trump's plan, Gaza would be governed by a temporary transitional body of Palestinian officials with a supervisory body called a Board of Peace to oversee it. One of the names tipped to be on that board, a familiar face to many, of course, the former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he was there alongside President Trump in Sharm el-Sheikh today. Also in attendance, the Palestinian Authority President, Mahmoud Abbas. Last month, he was denied a visa by the Trump administration to speak in person at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Today, he was shaking hands with the president. Now, one thing is clear, US interest and influence in the region will remain.
The minute we had inked the deal, Jared and I were already working on the implementation side of the deal. So we're dug in. We'll be here quite a bit. That's at the direction of the president. That's probably going to be one of the most important phases here. Jared is remarkable to work with. I talk about it all the time. And of course, we both love working for the president. So it's feels like a very honorable job.
Well, our panellists David Schenker and Laura Blumenfeld still here with us. Laura, on the future in this transitional body and the Board of Peace chaired by President Trump, how do you see that working?
Well, I think trust is really the fairy dust of diplomacy, and you're going to need members on that board who the people of the region trust. Again, I learned the hard way on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team at the State Department that experience is good, but baggage is bad. And so for some of these guys who've been around for decades, and unfortunately that might apply to Tony Blair, I admire him. He's a man with good intentions. But when his name is raised, hackles are raised as well. And rightly or wrongly, he's associated with that, the war with Iraq. I remember our president, and Condoleezza Rice talking about democracy in the Middle East is the moral mission of our time. Well, we all know that mission failed. Jared Kushner is a good contrast, though, because he's associated with success of the Abraham Accords. And so for someone like him, if he stays involved, I think it's a big plus. First of all, he's considered the prince. Look, they're dealing with royals, a lot of them in the Gulf, and he's inherently trusted. He has the ear on the confidence of the king, so to speak, President Trump. He also owns his identity, and so in some ways he's able to break rules that others couldn't in order to achieve success. He met face-to-face with Hamas leaders, according to reports. That's what brought us to that final handshake and this phase one success hostage release. That's something that perhaps another envoy wouldn't have dared. On the other hand, he was out there at the Western Wall, at the Jewish holy site, shaking the Jewish palm leaf for this holiday of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, and very openly owning and embracing his Jewish identity. That gave him the credibility to stand in Tel Aviv in Hostage Square, was it Saturday night, and say to hundreds of thousands of Israelis, we need to think about the Palestinians and their needs as well. He was able to show empathy, and that empathy was respected because of the position that he holds.
Okay, and David, what's your view of this sport of peace and how effective it can be?
Well, listen, they've mentioned some names. I think Naguib Sawiris maybe playing an economic role, but of Egypt. It will play a role. I think there are Palestinians who are saying that that Palestinians themselves are not playing a sufficient enough role, and there's no role for the PA. Of course, this is all because, I was back in the Bush administration. We supported the idea of Palestinian elections at the time. And of course, they went to elections in 2005 and elected Hamas. So it's no wonder, I think, the Trump administration came up and said, well, maybe they're not ready to take on this role yet. We have to do de-radicalization, reform, et cetera, first. But I think it's a worthy idea if you get people with experience who are actually going to be paying attention to this. But at the end of the day, this is all about senior level attention that is sustained, right? The longer that Jared and Witkoff are involved, the better off this is going to be.
Yeah, and indeed, Steve Witkoff saying today they've been inundated with applications from world leaders to be on that board of peace. So we will wait and see what those names will be when they're published. David Schenker and Laura Blumenfeld, thank you so much for joining us on The Context USA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's been an enormous day of developments as we've been discussing there. So we're going to leave you now with a look back at some of those key moments. Thanks for watching.